Hi, everyone. It's Mike Wise with the Boston Blockchain Association. Welcome and thanks for joining. The BBA has a threefold mission statement to advance blockchain technology worldwide, to establish Boston as one of the global hubs of blockchain innovation, and to bring educational resources to startups, entrepreneurs, and other blockchain enthusiasts. So we are well on our way to accomplishing those missions. You know, we're in unprecedented times. In fact, we have an unprecedented use of the term unprecedented these days. So this is our fourth virtual meetup. Our first meetup virtually was the blockchain use cases relative to coronavirus on April 2nd, I think it was. And we had 8 different sort of case studies around blockchain and coronavirus. It was really, really fantastic. Our second event was around innovation and regulation. And that was actually a replay of what was supposed to be a live event during Boston Blockchain Week, which was canceled because of COVID-19. That was very well attended, well received. And then the last event was just off the charts successful, had over 200 attendees around the world and has had 50 replays so far. It was all about digital currency, CBDC, central bank digital currency, and payments. We had Miko Matsumura, and David Markley with Algorand, and Thomas Arul with Bleumi. It was a really, really good. I highly recommend that you watch that. And in that event, we talked about digital identity as another key component to blockchain. So today we're going to be talking about digital identity, which is a nuanced topic. We've got privacy, security, legal and regulatory, ease of use. We typically have blockchain, AI, IoT, machine learning, a lot of the different new modern technologies involved in the technology stack. And we have a special shout out today to the Rhode Island blockchain community that we're trying to shine some light on. Yes, and special thanks to Toonie Shartner and the Venture Cafe in Providence, who suggested that we have Liz Tanner on this event. So the Boston Blockchain Association is a member-driven organization. We have a call to action in the bottom of your panel if you'd like to join or donate to the BBA. Also, you have the, and pay with crypto, right? You can pay with crypto, your member fees or your donations. And we also have the chat function on the right side of the user interface, and ask a question. So I plan to be asking questions of the panelists throughout. In that question panel, you can also vote on questions. So let's go around the horn and do some introductions. So let's do Liz, Moiz, and Sam. If you could just introduce yourselves, please.
Hello, my name is Liz Tanner. I am the Director of the Department of Business Regulation for the state of Rhode Island. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, my name is Moiz Kohari. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a data privacy company called Manetu. Prior to that, I was the global chief technology architect for State Street Bank, and I was in the same role with the London Stock Exchange Group prior to that.
Sam, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Sam Nathans. I'm a member of the Boston Blockchain Association's board. I've been a researcher in digital identity for upwards of 8 years now, and I'm the founder of SourceSurge, a nonprofit associated with digital identity, as well as Inturity, which is not a nonprofit company.
So it's fun to be on a board of directors. You know, they're usually very busy meetings, and you don't often get a chance to talk with your fellow board members. And Sam has always been very cagey about what exactly he does. And so when I brought up this topic of having a meetup around digital identity, he said, "Mike, can I talk to you afterwards?" So welcome, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining. Really appreciate it. So let's start with the problem statement. Let's go around the horn. Maybe Sam, Moiz, and Liz. What are we trying to solve here? We have privacy, security, compliance, enterprise, governments. What are we trying to solve here, Sam?
Well, so there's two major components to digital identity, and one is personal information, or attributes of personal information, and the other is identifiers, so aggregations of those various attributes that represent, at least in the digital space or from an information perspective, how an organization or another person or the government recognizes you as you, in the context of being a jury duty voter, in the context of being a regular voter, in the context of doing your taxes, any sort of municipal services, etc. And different parties are privy to different information. They care about different information as far as how they determine who you are. As far as identifiers are concerned, you can create digital identifiers and you can have physical identifiers as far as identity is concerned. Physical identifier being, your driver's license, a digital identifier being your email address. And there's a really hard problem in connecting these two types of identifiers because one, anyone can create, and the other, only trusted authorities that are intending to use this credential or this identifier for various purposes, such as the DMV or the RMV, can create. And there's a difficulty in connecting a physical way of authenticating you as a person to a digital representation of information that's supposed to be associated with you.
And so what is the problem? Connecting, digitizing?
It's sort of threefold. It's part of it is connecting the real world and the digital sphere as far as authentication and bringing in information and ensuring that it is authoritative and valid and true. And another part is ensuring that when you do have data in the digital space, that it is managed properly, that you have proper controls are placed on it as far as who can access it, what type of information will determine who has access to it or why they would be given permission to access it. And the last component has to do with, at least in the digital space, when you're talking about digital transformation from what was previously paper-based to digital, you can now do things such as deduplication, sharing information, more intelligent aspects of being able to leverage the same identity in multiple places, but not necessarily have it be reusable as a whole, but instead have components, attributes of your identity being used by multiple parties accordingly. So say you have your address listed for your mailing address, being able to change that in one place and have all the relevant parties who have a need to know that that address has been changed is changed accordingly. So imagine changing your address and the post office is already aware of that. Right. Your jury duty is already aware of that. Your tax authority is already aware of that. And so you're not going to get weird forwarded mail from jury duty from the other county that you used to live in and vice versa.
Right, exactly. Like my driver's license. There's some information on there a lot deeper than just my address, right? And I don't necessarily want to show, my date of birth. By the way, important safety tip for anybody that's using social networks, do not put your real date of birth on there. That's a really easy one to just don't do that. put something else in the right, proximity maybe, but
Yep.
that's the key thing. When you call up somebody and they ask you for your identity, the first question they ask is, what's your date of birth? Right? So you don't want that out on Facebook. All right, Moiz, let's hear from you.
So I'll accept all of what Sam was speaking to from a digital identity perspective. The way we would maybe phrase that is, how do you bring the sanctity of human experience, physical experience, into the digital world in such a way that that digital identity simply cannot be spoofed? And we can get into all the different things you can do, from multi-factor authentication to biometrics to post-quantum key distribution. And that ends up providing different levels of sensitivity clearance for that identity. Now, what do you do with that identity now in today's world with COVID and other things going on? We are being tracked, and every step of the way, right? Surveillance capitalism is basically how most of the large entities leverage your data, and they use it. Thankfully, both in Europe and the US and other places, there are laws that have been enacted already that require that companies, when they leverage your data, that at least you have the ability to provide consent or be able to revoke that data. So along with digital identity, right, Sam spoke to this, how you associate attributes and artifacts to a particular identity and be able to control that in a manner so that only people that you are allowing to be able to view those artifacts and attributes get to view it, and nobody else. So how do you create the most secure network that allows you to do that? And there are many projects out there. Web 3.0 has its own views and opinions on it. So we can touch on some of that. But at the end of the day, right, identity is one thing, but what you do with it and how you protect data and make sure that, as far as organizations and enterprises are concerned, that you are compliant to all the emerging laws around your ability to be able to leverage that data accordingly is really important. And that's an area of concentration for us at the moment.
Right. Yeah, at Manetu, I know that in looking at your website and you have a nice little video about that, which I recommend. It just kind of brings together these GDPR, CCPA, compliance. This is an issue for enterprise, and like anything else, you got to do it right, or you get stung.
Well, not only GDPR and CCPA, by the way, that is absolutely front and center, right, these days. But think about, even if some of these regulations didn't exist, okay, in my previous jobs, working for some of the largest organizations on the planet, right, we had the challenge of aggregating data from literally thousands of systems, okay? And how do you create a single source of truth? And how do you ensure that that data is being accessed by appropriate entities, right? So this challenge existed prior to some of these regulations.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, these regulations have, put a stick in the hand of the regulator to say, hey, if you're not really abiding by the rules, you can actually make sure that these organizations don't get to abuse that power.
Yes, and thank God for that. So, Liz, you introduced yourself. You're with the state of Rhode Island. You got the government perspective. Talk to us. What do you see as the problem statement?
So I come at it very differently. Being in charge of a state agency that licenses thousands of citizens and businesses across the entire globe, actually, for a variety of things. For me, what I'm trying to do is reduce the amount of paperwork. To share the information across across areas so that they don't have to come to my office and do it again at another office and, have to do the same thing over and over again. But it's also to break down the silos so that we are sharing information together so that, if somebody has a license with me, but they have a claim somewhere else, that we all know the situation and don't have to have separate systems to run that through. We also want to prevent problems from happening. So, if you think about people entering the wrong data or they have the wrong name, or in my situation, we have businesses, right? So if the name of the business starts with a the, sometimes it shows up in a system as a the, sometimes it shows up by yourself. So having one set of identity that's attached to you as a human, but as a business as well. So trying to connect the two of them. And then the overarching piece of that is eliminating bureaucracy. We're trying to break down the silos and make it easier to facilitate whatever it is you need to do through government. And so for us, that's what's super attractive about it, to try to move in that direction. It's going to take time, but we've got to start somewhere. Yeah,
just a small little project there. Nothing much really. Piece of cake. Ugh. So, okay, great. So great problem statements from all three of you. So let's talk about the new technologies that are out there: blockchain, AI, IoT. This is allowing some really good things to happen. As I said on LinkedIn today, we've got to get this right, though. If we can get this right, it will make a big difference over the long haul. If we get it wrong, there's this movie series called Terminator out there. You might want to take a look at it to see what happens when things go wrong with technology. So let's talk about the technology solutions. So let's reverse our order and go Sam or Liz, Sam, Moiz. Or Liz, Moiz, Sam. Yeah. Liz, what are you looking for? Or, what's the technology? What's the promise?
So, while my department, we're very close to being 100% online, there are large portions of government that are still paper form based. And, one thing that the pandemic really brought out was the need to go electronic, because when it happened and everything shut down, in my agency, and this was not something, I inherited a great agency, but we had been going towards having things more online in general. So while this has nothing to do with blockchain, it's just this move towards things being electronic. So for us, there was no blip at all. We continued our business without any kind of problems. But looking at, certainly the local governments and then some state agencies within Rhode Island that were still very heavily paper-based, having to come up with an entirely new process to receive the documents. And it really shut down government in a lot of, if not most of the municipal governments were entirely shut down until they could figure it out. So by moving things online and having them web-based versus, there are lots of governments that have, ancient systems that are only accessible from state-owned computers that are connected to the state network. You've got to move that over. So for us, that's certainly one of the key factors for us.
Moving online, internet.
Moving online, period, but also making it easier for business, right? So I like to talk often about opening a restaurant. So to open up a restaurant in the state of Rhode Island, and probably just like any other state in Rhode Island, you'd have to go to 13 different state, local, and federal agencies to make that happen. And within those 13 different websites or paper forms that you would have to fill out, there's more underneath it. So if you could put in your information, I could put in Liz Tanner, I own ABC Restaurant, and that information would carry over. How great would that be to have it all done in one place to prevent the problems from happening, right? So if I want to do some construction on my building, but maybe I can't because I'm on the water, or there's some sewage problems, or whatever it might be, I would know that in advance, because everybody would know what I was trying to do, rather than only my silo knows what I want to do. And so I can prevent the problem from happening later. Is that helping you?
Yeah. So if I'm hearing it right, it's more the digital identity in your case of a company, of what you're trying to accomplish as a company.
But that's the twist, right? You can't do one without the other, right? So if you could do it as a company, you would have the ability to do that. But I might also need my professional license. So in order to open up a restaurant, I have to have a food safety license. How do I get both of those to be attached to each other so that you have that connection? You know, Sam was saying some really interesting things. He gets what my problem is. He totally understands. But we've all experienced governmental bureaucracy in our lives, and you know, being able to have a digital identity. I'm a big fan of what Estonia does. I'm an e-resident, and I very much pay attention to what they've done, and it's something that all American states should try to model.
Yeah, I shared that link to the Estonia Digital Identity Project in the chat window. So for those that are listening, if you scroll up to the top of the chat, you can see that. But just Google Estonia Digital Identity, and it's pretty impressive what they've done. They've been working on this since they came out of the Soviet Union. And gee, it kind of makes me want to move to Estonia, I gotta say, start a business there. So I think the next one is Moiz. Moiz, talk about what's the promise of this new technology stack?
Well, look, technologies, you can go back as far as you want, right? We have evolved, and you know, I would suggest that we don't lead with technology. There are problems that technologies create, okay, such as, let's say, post-quantum computers. They're certainly going to create the problem of cryptography and our current cryptographic systems just coming to its knees and people being able to compromise that very quickly and easily, right? So technology, or you could talk about blockchain. And, you know, when we were working on blockchain years ago, right, people were rightfully asking, well, how's that any different from a database? But it's distributed, you drive consensus, it's got networking stack built in. So great, you know, you've got great integrated technologies that are available to you. I'll step back and ask, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So to Liz's point, right, forget about technology, and we will leverage technology to solve some of these problems. But to Liz's point, right, she's saying, look, I need identity. So when we talk about identity, I'm not suggesting that the identity has to be a human, right? A application has its own identity. You know, an enterprise has its own identity.
Building.
Yeah. So the way I would suggest thinking about identity is simply an endpoint. Okay. Who controls that particular endpoint, and can you ensure that that endpoint cannot be spoofed, regardless of any technology that you bring to the table? Okay. So if you are able to do that, now you're speaking to endpoints. The way we would like to approach the problem is to suggest that in order to define very, very strong endpoints, you need to have certain types of capabilities, such as secure enclaves built into, you know, networks and hardware that is running those secure enclaves, such that, you know, only Moiz is able to have that operate as Moiz. And then when I connect into a particular network, I know exactly what the other endpoints are. So when I want to share that information with those endpoints, I know exactly who I'm sharing that information. Now, if you can start to do that, okay, then the problem of, you know, the restaurant example of, well, wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to go to 13 different agencies to get approval, right, becomes a little more manageable, because if you can ensure that a particular data wallet, if you will, has all of the attributes associated with it, and only the agencies that need to look at specific attributes have access to those attributes, becomes a really interesting problem to solve, right? Now, you spoke of many things when we started to initiate this conversation, such as, you know, what about blockchain? What about IoT? What about machine learning and AI, right? All of these tools in our tool set are fantastic, right? Because there are certain types of things that I can do with ML algorithms, whether it be from an NLP perspective, natural language processing perspective, or whether from a predictive analytics perspective, right? How I leverage these tools for the appropriate problem set is the real question. So as the problem set, we're trying to solve, let's say, Rhode Island's issue of creating strong identities, or is it additionally other things such as that you are accepting some of the larger players tracking you because of the pandemic that we're in, and can you ensure that they will only track you for certain purposes and not other purposes, and can you ensure that that data is being leveraged for appropriate usage? So how can we do that? And I would suggest that the government has a role to play here, because while the government has asked some of these technology entities to step up and help us with this pandemic, how do we control that data access, once this pandemic has been handled, hopefully quickly?
Okay, great. So awesome. I'm going to have to listen to this about 5 times to pick up all the nuances of what you just said. So thank you for sharing that, Sam. I can almost hear some of the things you're thinking about this, about what Moiz said, and also what Liz said about, and some of the ways that we can solve some of these issues. What are your comments?
So Moiz was right in the sense that it's not about just a personal identity, and in many ways, such as upon Liz's point, where in certain aspects, a corporation also has an identity as an aggregate of people as well as governance. But buildings have identities. They've got addresses. They have specific locations within those buildings that are maybe addressable components of a building. And so identifiers is probably a more apt way of talking about them. And there's actually a number of projects that use that terminology, such as distributed digital identifiers, or DIDs. And in the context of securing data and making sure that it's only accessed for specific purposes, in terms of ensuring that transparency only goes so far, so awareness of data, and especially one of the biggest problems, which is context of that data, because there's a lot of things that can be ascertained through 2 pieces of data, 2 attributes, that their association with each other, the context, actually gives you more relevant information about the individual, or the actual information itself, than may be preferable. And so you have to structure these data sharing systems, these consent mapped processes, to ensure that context from the information that's being provided is not overstepping the boundary of the intent of that sharing. So some aspects of how this might work is, instead of necessarily having one wallet with your attributes and sharing information, I'm sure many of you are familiar with OAuth, which is if you log in via Google into any extra service, you're going to connect to Google. You'll log in via Microsoft to any of the services connected via Microsoft. They'll usually give you this little splash landing page that talks about what this service wants to access as far as your Google account is concerned, or your Microsoft account is concerned, when it comes to either your calendar or your document storage, or a specific folder in your document storage rather than the actual entirety of your document storage. So that is when you have a single identifier with a whole bunch of access, that you're then using that sort of monolithic access and permissioning structure based around that to ensure that there's a compartmentalization or granular access controls associated with those attributes. Another way that I am still doing research around, but I find potentially more interesting, is instead encoding the whole structure as separate identities, in the sense that if it's important that a resident of a particular building is informed about a specific thing associated with services or utilities to that building, then instead the building itself, the address, should have its own ID that it signs with, but also is connected to an association, so that message passing and consent mapping can occur to the residents of that address without necessarily exposing their higher level or their more root level identities, whether you're talking about taxpayer information or identities, or voter registration. So there are different numbers or identifiers that are associated with different aspects of services provided to an individual. And I would posit that those should actually be separate identities with separate attributes that you can create associations both hierarchically and non-hierarchically between those subcomponents of identity. And so this is what I refer to as disaggregated identity, in the sense that when you're talking to a specific agency, or you're talking to a specific service provider, and they're asking for personally identifying information to confirm you are who you say you are, or aspects of you in order to gain better information about how they can assist you, such as delivering a package or what service address you were at for your ISP, that they are in effect taking an aggregate of personal information that is relevant to their ability to assist you, rather than actually looking at an entirety and then determining what is relevant to them. So it's a sort of semantical difference as to whether or not you're going with a monolithic structure or this more fragmented sort of just-in-time aggregation of identity. And that's part of what I've been exploring in research. But those are two technical ways that you can approach it. And Moiz also has a very particular perspective in this area that he's been pursuing with his company. And by all means, I think that's very valid and accurate.
Yeah.
Might be the best way of going about it. I don't know.
Right. Well, it's a niche solution, Manetu. So we've got people, we've got things, we've got buildings, we've got context, we've got environments. There's so much involved in this. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So let me shift it over to Liz. Liz, and you said, we've got all these things we want to accomplish. I'm guessing, and I know you can't talk too many details about your project because it's not a public thing yet, but hypothetically speaking, how would you, and one of the questions, by the way, in the crowdcast is, how do you get started with all of this? So Liz, you're a perfect example of this. How are you thinking about biting this off in chunks?
So I'll say that from someone else's point of view, what had to happen for it to happen in Rhode Island was for somebody to understand it, right? So the audience will appreciate that when we had a prep call earlier, I made sure to let everybody know I am not a tech person at all. I don't understand half of how blockchain works, but what I do understand is how to use it, right? So while you all are the folks who understand the technology side, I understand the fact of what it can do, right? So from a governmental side, and so that's what it took for me, was to say, I really embrace this. I see what the possibilities are. And then I was lucky enough to have a governor who believes in it, right? Who believes in new technology. So number one in getting any of these projects started is somebody who believes in it, right? And somebody who's willing to take a risk, right? Right. And that has nothing to do with the blockchain, but you've got to get somebody who's willing to try and not just do the same things over and over again. So I was blessed to have that. That said, for us, it was originally more about the opening a restaurant concept. It was very much about how do we make it easier. And then when we realized that was really a small project, we said, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. Let's get it going from the beginning with digital identity. So that's where we've even evolved our thinking ourselves, because once we put the RFP out, which Rhode Island was the first state in the country to put out an RFP to invite blockchain to government, we got so many great proposals that when we started hearing what the possibilities were, we realized that we were thinking way too small, and we said we need to think bigger. So we are looking at digital identity, and the way we're looking at it is from my agency's point of view, because again, I am the person who understands what it can do, but I would love to see it at the motor vehicles department. I would love to see it with our corporations. I would love to see it with land evidence, but they don't understand it or believe in it yet. So we want to start it at the Department of Business Regulation, in the licensing credentialing space, because that's what I do. And then if successful, then we can say, look, this is what it can do. This is what the possibilities are. Now that we have the identity at the top, then we can start to add things on underneath, right? So then maybe we can add motor vehicles, maybe we can add corporations, whatever it might be. So that's kind of how to get it started. But we're also purposely starting small. We don't want to start with corporations, and we don't want to start with motor vehicles. We want to start small, make sure we get it right, make sure it's safe and secure. And then we hope to be able to expand it to other things.
So the key there is having a governor that was, that she understood it as well, and as we all know, the same thing applies to business and enterprise. The key is having a CEO or a leadership team that really understands what they do and don't know, and where to find information, et cetera. So Moiz, you spent some time with the London Stock Exchange and their digital transformation and dealing with assets that are in the, I think we said 12 zeros. Okay. So just a little bit of sensitivity there. So you heard what Liz just was saying about, taking it. Can you just comment on that from your perspective at the enterprise and compliance and so forth?
Yeah. And I was lucky enough to work with lots of zeros at State Street Bank, a Boston institution. So, here, I absolutely agree with Liz. The only way you can have a successful project is to identify exactly how you can have an impact on a specific thing that you need to have an impact on, and run with it and hopefully show success, because otherwise things get lost, right? So absolutely, that is the key. In our scenario, right, when we were looking at blockchain, one of the core things that we found blockchain, because we weren't doing crypto asset movements and things like that, right? Others were. But what we found blockchain to be extremely useful at was, look, at the end of the night, between our clients and ourselves, there was trillions of dollars worth of, or hundreds of billions of dollars worth of reconciliation that needed to happen on a nightly basis. Okay. That literally translated to thousands of manual hours of hundreds of people working on it before the next day started, right? And if you leverage appropriate technology like blockchain for that, in this case, I'm a huge fan of blockchain, right? Because it does exactly that. It creates a reconciliation-less system where basically the transaction is the transaction. People have already validated that, consensus was reached, appropriate identities had that transaction. So I think that it's absolutely critical to understand what you want to apply the technology to and have projects that you can stand up and show success. Now, something that we were discussing earlier, right, around identity, and identity being such a I'll just call it onerous concept, because buildings can have identities, everything can have identities. The one way I would suggest we could think about it, and I know most of you are probably thinking about it the same way, is, look, there are actors, and actors must have identities, and then there is data. Okay, so that's where data ontology and data lineage comes into play. If you appropriately tag and have metadata tags associated with the right data, and you can start to create these trees that allow you to really ensure that you can track data, you can track actors. And if you can do that appropriately, right, you can pretty much think about it this way again. It's simply tool sets. If we have all the right tools in our bag, then I can pretty much build you anything you want. And if I don't have the right tools, then it's going to be a struggle.
Moiz, we lost you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure where you lost me, but
Oh,
speaking of data ontology and data,
No, I
data
think
lineage.
we lost you when you stopped talking. We weren't sure if you were done or not.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. All right. Then I guess I was done. Back to you,
my
Mike.
fault. My fault. I was looking on the Crowdcast site at a question, and then you stopped talking, but I saw you still talking on the Crowd site. There's a little bit of a delay. Okay, let me ask a question from Crowdcast. So, until we have the ability to create digital identities at the point of birth, so Evernham's Illinois project, it seems like any remediation involving those of us already in existence, there is an amazing business opportunity to avoid a garbage in, garbage out situation. Are companies like those you represent working on a protocol with certifying entities, notaries, et cetera, to put in as many checks as possible to guarantee the information making up digital identities so that it's pure? So garbage in, garbage out. Can we talk about that? Sam, what do you think?
So I find it kind of funny that even if you're given an identity at birth, that's just one attribute of who you are. It's the attribute that you are unique, you are an individual. It's a very similar attribute to any sort of biometric function, is that it's not a good identifier of who you are as a person. It's not a good identifier of what you can do or what you have done. In many ways, it's actually potentially a very bad aggregation point for a bunch of information that might want to have forgotten or removed from your record, etc. And it's also a terrible password. Biometrics are terrible passwords for the most high-level sensitive information or sensitive access. So if you look at what other identities have been provided to individuals at birth, the Social Security system being one of them, and granted the context of its creation being just a schema associated with your location and your date of birth at the time, it's relatively easy to determine what your Social Security number is. If I know what your date of birth is, I know generally where you were born. And I don't know, I might have the information from the Equifax breach and have at least a third that I can associate already with names and various date of births to be able to go through and figure out. So it's just the fact that it's provided to you or built around a context of a beginning of a person's individual life does not necessarily make it secure. So the context of building identities from a post-birth scenario in terms of everyone that's already alive right now, you can use those similar factors of uniqueness. You can use biometrics to ensure uniqueness, that when you're setting up a root level account that's everything's supposed to eventually be managed through is unique per person. And you don't have to go back to birth to do that. And there are a number of companies, there are a number of nonprofit initiatives, there are a number of government initiatives that are looking to solve this problem for different aspects of your digital life, whether you're interacting with other companies, whether you're interacting with the government, whether you're interacting with your friends. Yeah.
Well, that's really good, because that just answered one of the questions about biometrics. We have a global audience on this call, and some of the one of the questions deals with multinationals. Moiz, I know you've spent some time in London, Boston, et cetera, in your travels. So can you comment on the multinational piece to this, Moiz?
Look, I would suggest that whether it's the identity of an actor or whether it's the identity of data itself, right? It holds no national boundaries. Okay, we can certainly assign a passport number to my identity if you want, and it could be from the US or it could be from somewhere else. It's pretty much the same. So I think what Sam was talking about, that if you were creating that digital identity at birth, how much different would that be from you creating that identity for Mike today? I don't think it would be much different. What you need to ensure and how you ensure that is, many different ways. Look, I've worked for some 3-letter government agencies in the past lives where, the only way to secure anything is that nobody has access to it, right? There is no network, period. Okay. So, it depends on what level of sensitivity and security you're talking about. And we can solve for that. If you have the right requirements, we can solve for that. In this particular scenario, I would simply suggest that if the requirement is that we want to establish Mike's identity and we want to ensure that Mike is who he claims he is, right? There are mechanisms of doing that, whether it's a combination of biometrics, whether it's a combination of ensuring that Mike is the owner of certain domains and, creating these multi-factor authentication capabilities. You can do that. And then what you do with it, how do we allow Mike to operate? Those are really fun problems to be working on.
Liz, let's go over to you. And I know that, the state of Wyoming with Caitlin Long out there. And by the way, if you want to follow Caitlin Long, she's what I call the Ripley of blockchain. Ripley from Aliens. I say we dust off and nuke the entire site from orbit. So Liz, Rhode Island, the smallest state in the union, and it's leading the way. What are some of the barriers that other people can expect to face when it comes to a blockchain-based, digital identity-based platform like you're doing?
So I can tell you, Wyoming's been interesting because we were kind of in a little bit of a race with them because they were passing all sorts of laws to allow for digital currency there, and we discovered we didn't need to do it, right? So when we did our research, we didn't have to change our money transmitter laws. Our current laws were open and wide enough for us to do these. So be cautious when you see states having to change their laws to allow for certain things, because that means that they were really in a bad spot to not be able to. Whereas Rhode Island, we changed one thing just to make the licensing structure easier. We didn't have to change anything to allow for crypto. But I want to go back to the last question about the identity and where to start. And so totally agree with my fellow panelists, but something that we're exploring is, again, that business aspect, right? So there's thousands and thousands of new corporations in a state every single year. And that happens often. And so if you can start with business, right? Like, so that to me is a little safer than my personal identification. So that's something that I'd like to explore, something that we'd like to look at. I almost don't want to share that information because I'm afraid other people will do it before we do. But, allowing a corporate identity to be the first use case seems a lot safer, right? Now, to Sam's point, maybe your property is a lot easier too. So when you do look at other states, there are plenty of counties who have started to set up land evidence records on the blockchain, and I think that's a nice, safer way to start as well. I haven't seen any states necessarily doing it. I know Wyoming's trying. I'm not sure if they have. I have not done my research since the pandemic started, but everybody's trying a little bit, but everybody's a little bit nervous. So, but the corporate identity piece is a way to start that's very different than from a human perspective. And so I'd like to try to do something like that in Rhode Island, because it seems safer and a little easier.
Well, and there's a lot at stake from successfully doing that as well, right? Because just like if you look at the Estonia content, they're trying to draw, startups and businesses to come there. And so, gee, if Rhode Island draws, some future, high-profile startups into the state, that's going to employ a lot of people. That's going to bring in a lot of revenue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I can see why you'd want to do that. Well, we're at 7:22. I think it'd be a good time to just close with some comments about the future. So let's go around the horn one more time. Short answers. What do you hope for? Let's say, I know it's impossible to envision, but just what do you hope for in 3 to 5 years? Liz, why don't you start, and then Moiz and Sam. Short answers.
I think you'll see more and more states trying to expand the technology in different ways. I've been impressed with what Reno, Nevada has done. Delaware, if they can move their corporate piece, I think you'll see some change. Reno put their marriage certificates, unusual situation for them. I thought that was great. And then particularly, I believe it's the counties, Cook County in Illinois, and then I can't remember which one it is in Vermont, but they've done some land evidence. So it's neat to see everybody trying to do things. Where there's also been an effort by the states to try to use the same language. So we're creating definitions for things. So I think in 3 to 5 years, you'll certainly see the states all agreeing on definitions. And I think that will make a big difference, because then there won't be differences. And ideally, we can work together on our regulations too, so that there's some consistency, and we don't have to rewrite them down the road because half the states are going one direction and another half are going the other way. So that's something that I think you'll see worked out in the next 3 to 5 years.
Awesome. That would be so great. Moiz?
I'm hoping that we and our loved ones are all going to be safe. And then, as far as some of these interesting data and privacy laws and regulations emerging, I hope that we have consistency across the globe, and we have appropriate management that allows for safe usage of this data for the enterprises and for the individuals, because some of the machine learning and AI scenarios that you were alluding to earlier, are not that far-fetched if we don't appropriately treat the data. So my hope is that we have laws and regulations that are consistent and make the appropriate enterprises actually liable for the usage of that information.
Yeah, I can see why you're such a highly accomplished person, because it's so important to start with the problem. Let's clearly identify the problem before we start getting all wrapped around the axle with the technology. Let's identify the problem. And I had an insurance executive say to me one time, Mike, I'm so glad that you're doing blockchain. This is great. It's a new technology. Can I just ask you to do me a favor? Can you get a lot of people in the room and figure out what we should not do with this technology first? Because that way we can head off a lot of problems.
If I may interrupt, I will humbly suggest that the only reason I'm successful at any degree is just because of the friends and teams that have surrounded me in the past. It has less to do with myself and my ability to have the right people around me.
Yeah. Okay, well said. In fact, I was referred to you by somebody who used to be on your team. So that speaks volumes right there. So Sam, what about you? What is your hope for the future? Short answer.
So sort of a three-parter, getting progressively towards this aspirational aspect. One is that any sort of initiatives that will be successful will take practical execution over perfection. into account. You don't need to solve problems in a way that is fundamentally perfect, as long as it is either an analog to what we have right now, but slightly more efficient, slightly more secure, slightly faster. That's enough, especially when you're talking about things like voting, things like jury duty, things like registration of licenses and companies. And so a lot of that has to do with how you approach designing or determining what blockchain is well suited for when you search for what digital identity is good for, when you're looking for solutions around that or that leverage it. And that fundamentally comes down to user experiences, and not necessarily from a UI perspective, though that is part of it, but more from a process flow perspective. What kind of workflows or process flows or series of actions and causes effect can I simplify? Can I optimize? Can I make more connected with other experiences that relate or depend upon it or are associated with it? And it sort of brings to the point of the aspiration, which is I'm hoping that over time you'll see things like form entry for government forms. The forms are not necessarily the actual medium of input or the medium of storage of that information, but in fact, forms themselves are just interfaces with which how information that's being used to populate them is interpreted. That you start to see some of these as government and information and around identity becomes more digitized, you'll start to see more interoperability between various parties, not just in the same state or in the same region, but across various borders. You'll start to get better standardization. And I think a lot of that will come with computational law. A lot of that will come with smart contracts as part of computational law. And really, at the end of things, I'm hoping to see a more digital system of interactions between people, objects, and entities that are all associated, bound together by recognition between each other. That's driven by digital identity. And yeah.
Awesome. Man, I am so glad that this event was recorded because I'm going to want to go back over it again many times. Well, this has been really, really good. So Liz Tanner, thank you so much. Where can people find out more about you and your project?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Liz Tanner, or you can feel free to email me, liz.tanner@dbr.ri.gov.
Okay. And Moiz, where can people find you?
I'm also on LinkedIn, and my company is Manetu. That's Manetu.com.
Okay. And Sam, is there any place to find you? I know you're very difficult to find.
My email address is shnathans@sourcesurge.org. Feel free to drop me a line, start up a conversation anytime, or on LinkedIn, start up a conversation. Don't just reach out to me and try to connect on me. I'm LinkedIn's /SHNathans.
Okay, great. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. If I could just give a plug for next meetup, which is in 2 weeks from tonight on June 25th, it's all going to be about startups. We're going to have Sarah Biller, the queen of Boston FinTech, and the one of the co-founders of the Boston FinTech Sandbox. We're going to have Matt Walsh, who is a VC with Castle Island Ventures in Boston, and Nate Rand, who was also formerly with State Street Bank. Eric Rue is going to be moderating that panel from the Boston Blockchain Association board. It's going to be all about startups, boards, goals, roles, and process, common mistakes, opportunities, blockchain opportunities. So remember that the Boston Blockchain Association is a member-driven organization. There's a link in the call to action at the bottom of your interface where you can join or donate, and you can pay with crypto. So please rate this session on Meetup as well. And on behalf of the Boston Blockchain Association, this